Welcome to Fort Worth 148's podcast, where we meet to discuss Masonic topics and strive to build value in the Brotherhood. The opinions and statements of the participants do not represent any positions or stance of any Grand Lodge or Lodge and are solely the viewpoints of the participants. Welcome back to the podcast, brother. This is Rhit Moore, past master of Fort Worth 148.
This is Billy Hamilton, past master of Fort Worth 148.
This is Gabe Yagish, past master and sitting marshal of Fort Worth 148, and we have a guest today.
Hello, this is David Hill. I'm past master of Parsons number 222. Current chaplain. I actually recently passed on the secretary's desk after sitting there for just 3 years. I'll consider that a success.
So you escaped unscathed is what
I did, without it being a life sentence.
I think
That's
every
getting
secretary
more
strives for that.
Yeah, and that's getting more common, which is a good thing in my opinion.
I agree fully. I think more brethren should be trained to run all aspects of the lodge.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun as secretary for sure.
Mm-hmm.
We've recently shanghaied our friend Cody Cox into becoming secretary for the lodge, so we'll see how he does there. He has this talent in other, he's demonstrated this talent in other areas, so we have no doubt as to his assiduity. Hopefully he will do just fine.
It'll be fantastic.
His what?
His assiduity.
Oh, you're using big words. Sorry. Let me look that up real quick.
I busted out one of them $5 words on you, right? I'm sure. Listen, man,
he does.
You got to step
nice
up your game, because we all know that your favorite Masonic hero, George Washington, definitely knew that word.
Oh man, it's so true.
And in all fairness, Rhit, aren't you the one who used to talk about how you love the word egregore? Was it you?
Well, I did after I learned it. That was a Robert Hurd thing years and years ago. He came and taught us that word, and it was like, oh, that's my new thing.
I think all four of us have a deep appreciation of the word egregore,
right?
As a very special sort of word. For the audience, the egregore is like the spirit of an organization of people. That's a vague and general description, and it's not completely correct, but that's the less than 5-minute explanation.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. Well, folks, as you know, or as he's introduced himself, we have David Hill on the podcast today, and Dr. Hill is a repeat guest from season 3, and David, what's going on in your life, personally, Masonically? What's new since we last talked to you?
Well, Masonically, I recently served as reunion director for the Austin Valley of the Scottish Rite. That was a new experience for me. I got to be the guy in the metaphorical top hat in the middle of the 3-ring circus. It was fun, establishing order out of chaos. So I had a great time doing that, and don't know if they'll have me do it next year, but I'm certainly open to it.
Ordo ab cao. I see what you did there.
Hey, there we go. Other than that, I guess personally, I've just inherited my father-in-law's motorcycle. He's now he has Parkinson's and is now infirm enough to where he has no business riding, which is kind of difficult. He's been riding a motorcycle his whole life. So when a guy gives up his last bike, the one he was hoping to ride into retirement, it's a big deal. So it's kind of I'm feel really honored that he sent it my direction. I've certainly been enjoying getting to know it and riding it around town. At the same time, that's a part of his identity he was giving up. So I really honor that from him, and it's a pretty difficult transition.
Yeah, that's got to be tough.
Well, it's kind of a fantastic way to, while he's still here, be able to keep his spirit of riding alive,
Oh, absolutely.
That's
it's really cool.
Yeah. So, all right, Billy. So I know that, you were kind of the most involved in setting up the writing for this episode, and you and I had talked about this offline, and had a couple of serious conversations about what inspired this episode's content. If you want to give us a breakdown and kind of an introduction to what we're going to be talking about today and why we're going to be talking about it, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, so um, if y'all listened to, I believe it was the episode before last, we had Brother Chuck Dunning on, and we were talking about mental self-care, right? How to recognize maybe the warning signs in yourself that you're dealing with depression or worse, and what to do about it, right? And then extending upon that, how to recognize those signs in others, and what to do to maybe help encourage them to find the help they need. However, this episode is really it's a part 2 of that same vein, but it is how to deal with people that we come in contact that are maybe charged up emotionally or mentally, dealing with some stresses, maybe fixated on masonry as something evil or bad, and how do we deal with that, right? How do we approach those people if needed, and how can we resolve any kind of confrontation in a way that would result in a safe conclusion to the encounter? And so for this reason, I asked, Dr. Hill if he would be willing to talk with us, because this is right in line with a lot of the work that he's been doing as a counselor, and therapist. And so he graciously agreed to do this. So, and, I hate to bring this up, but, recently we did have tragedy in the fraternity, which directly touches upon this subject. And so it felt like a timely moment to have this conversation.
And for those of you listeners that don't know, the tragedy that we're mentioning here was very recent at the time of the recording of this podcast. And we are trying to be as sensitive and respectful to it as possible, which is why we're releasing this episode, right? In just a few days ago, last week, a lodge installation took place down in McAllen, Texas. And they had the chapter installation, the council installation, and then the lodge installation. And following the lodge installation, one of the brothers, Robert Wise, exited the building, and he was very quickly approached by somebody who really can't be described as anything other than a madman. And I know that that's probably an insensitive way to describe that person, but that's what I'm going with. And this guy killed our brother because he was a Mason, and we know that because of his admissions via social media and his very digitally public hatred of Masonry. And so that's one of the reasons why we're releasing this episode, is to kind of, tackle that and see, what if anything can be done in that avenue.
Yeah, I think a lot of lodges have been, kind of perking up to these kinds of threats that are going on. But, there's been little small things happen here and there. I say little small things. Lodges have been burnt down and, but no one had really been hurt. Mm-hmm. And this changed the game.
And actually, Rhit, do you want to tell us? So Fort Worth Lodge has had a little bit of history in terms of close encounters. Mm-hmm. Do you want to give us a short history of the variety of threats and whatnot that have been made against Fort Worth Lodge?
Sure. Yeah, I guess the major one was that was like right when we got started with the investigation process that we have now. That the gentleman ended up being on the terroristic watch list. It was a whole long story how it all came about, but he ended up attacking the FBI agents that went to his house the second time they went, and he was arrested for it and then deemed unfit to stand trial. So that was a real close call, because he was 4 months in, and we kind of liked the guy at first, and then he just kind of went off on his own, off the deep end, I'd say. And started throwing up red flags. And then eventually we just told him, it's not for you. And he really went off the deep end. But I mean,
guys, that says something. If you're deemed not fit to stand trial due to a mental health issue, then that a psychologist has examined you, a forensic psychologist has, and determined that you cannot participate adequately in your own defense because of whatever mental health issue that you're undergoing. That's pretty serious. And it says a lot that, he was there for a few months and y'all liked the guy. And then all of a sudden something got triggered and he took that spiral downward so quickly.
Yeah. And we do get a lot of guys, like the initial email that they'll send up will be just completely crazy, about not your typical join the Illuminati stuff, but, what they're saying, devil worshiper, all that kind of crazy stuff. On the initial email, of course, they don't get an invite up, but I mean, it's definitely more prevalent. People are more empowered for this kind of stuff, it seems like, than they have been when I was younger. I mean, it's always gone on, but this is amped up a little bit. And that's across everything. Cause, I saw guys lashing out on social media about, how this is so horrible, what's wrong with this. And it's like, it's time to wake up, because it's horrible that it happened at a lodge, but it's happened at churches. It's happening at our schools. You know what I mean? We've got to watch out for each other, and we have to start talking about these things so we can be safer and be aware. As unfortunate as it is, it's a part of life now.
Now, Brother David, I know you've previously done this, but treating this podcast episode as, in a vacuum, could you tell us a little bit about yourself in terms of professional background?
Sure. I have a doctorate in clinical psychology. Have a private practice in Austin where I do a lot of work. These days, I'm working primarily with veterans, helping them with compensation and pension claims with the VA. I deal with a lot of combat vets and other people who have had some deep trauma, and helping them to process some of the worst days of their lives. In past years, I've done forensic work. I did a postdoc for 2 years at juvenile probation in Travis County, working with some of the kids there. Worked in methadone clinics, community clinics, all over the place. So have a pretty broad range of experience in the mental health field.
Okay. I think that gives us a pretty good kind of ground establishment there. So let's talk about, the fixation on Masonry and, what, because it seems like there's a lot of guys or gals, I guess, there's a lot of individuals out there that we could classify as less than mentally stable that get fixated on Freemasonry, particularly, or maybe on the concept of secret societies. And you start to hear some very scary theories coming out of them, and sometimes they take action on. So let's talk about that. Why do these people get fixated on Freemasonry and secret societies, and what is it that is so attractive about that idea to them?
Sure. There's a couple different main points. So one, there's people undergoing some form of psychosis, which I'll get into in a moment. The other is people who just have more conspiratorial mindset, which I'll unpack in a moment. Psychosis is like you can have a delusion where you believe something to be true despite evidence to the contrary. I spent a year as a predoctoral intern at San Antonio State Hospital and worked in their forensic and acute inpatient units. One of the things I saw from psychotic patients is that there tends to be three main fixations. It's God, government, and sex. Those are the big three that people tend to focus on. Of course, you have your Jesus delusions, where on one unit we had three people who thought they were Jesus, and it's kind of interesting because they'd post up in opposite wings from each other, so they didn't have to be around each other, and they would studiously ignore each other when they were in the common room, but they sure would preach on either sides of the wings. and people who think that they're literally God. There are, of course, all sorts of government conspiracy thoughts, people putting microphones in my teeth or all sorts of craziness. Oh, the microchips, like the government putting microchips in the vaccines, that sort of thing. And then there's always sexual delusions, which can get very, very bizarre, which I'll spare y'all the details. So that's
we thank you for it.
Yeah, that's more on the psychosis side of the field, but that tends to be pretty blatantly obvious because people are saying things that just really make no sense at all. But that's more of a minority, actually. Most of the people who are involved in conspiratorial thinking, it's kind of a spectrum. I mean, some people are kind of conspiratorial minded. It's just the way they like to be, to try and see if they can peek below the veil and see some of the inner workings of what's going on in society. Some people, a lot of people feel a sense of anxiety. So it can be really comforting to blame a grand conspiracy rather than the chaos that life and society are truly made of. I mean, people feel like they don't have much power. And if they can fixate on some grand conspiracy, like the Masonic fraternity ruling the world, we always just say the old joke, but I'm a 33rd degree Mason. Oh, well, you're still not high enough to really know the secret, right? That sort of thing. Really perceived threats to society can make people more prone to conspiratorial thinking. Think about what's been happening for years now in our political rhetoric. Both sides of the aisle, we're getting the same thing. They're playing us off against each other left and right. It's one of the things where Masonry is a beautiful organization because we can come together despite our political backgrounds and really talk and come together as men and enjoy fellowship and harmony. But in the political rhetoric, you have people saying, they're not on my team, they're the enemy. Oh, well, they're not on my team, they must be the enemy. Whole families have become split apart in recent years over this sort of thing. This idea that the country and our moral fiber are circling the drain. All of this has really been sort of put to us by and large by the news, 24-hour news media, and politics, and it's in many ways it's propaganda. It's a way of playing us off against each other, and that causes people to feel anxiety. Heck, I've sharply reduced my news intake, and I recommend to my patients I'll put them on news diets if they start getting too anxious. Right? I mean, it's gotten pretty bad.
Yes.
So if somebody's already anxiety prone, they feel like their life is going out of control. They feel like society is going out of control, like our great American experiment is unraveling at the seams. They can really say, well, it was the Masons that founded America, so maybe they're behind this deal. It's a grand cabal. Other things, feeling alienated or unwanted. Conspiracies can make people feel like they're in the know and they can gather with other conspiracy theorists. They do that online all the time. There's a social identity motive, right? So they want to identify socially with a group, so they're part of the in group, and it can feed a desire for uniqueness or superiority, especially if they've been alienated by society at large, which if you're going out spouting conspiracy theories, usually people are going to think that's pretty wacky, and you may find yourself alienated. But once you find other conspiracy theorists, all of a sudden you're a part of the group. And there's a sense of belongingness that from a social perspective, there's a strong pull for that. Now, there was a recent article that the American Psychological Association cited online. It's a study that analyzed data from 170 different studies with over 158,000 participants, primarily from the US, United Kingdom, and Poland. The study's called The Conspiratorial Mind, a meta-analytic review of motivational and personological correlates, which that's a mouthful. But it was published in Psychological Bulletin on June 16th of this year. Now, what they found is that a couple things. That conspiracy theorists are often driven by a need to understand their environment, like I said, a desire for superiority, and certain personality traits such as paranoia and egocentrism. That egocentrism, it makes sense because if you have the secret knowledge about how the world and the universe works when nobody else has been able to figure it out, what makes you the special one, right? The study found that those who strongly believed in conspiracy theories were also more likely to be insecure, paranoid, emotionally volatile, impulsive, suspicious, withdrawn, manipulative, egocentric, and eccentric. They can be a little bit wacky. I mean, I don't think that everyone who believes in conspiracy theories can necessarily be considered a madman or unhinged or whatever. There's plenty of people who are otherwise rational, intelligent, engaged people who start to get sucked into these things, and it becomes attractive to them for whatever reason. But they did find that teaching analytical thinking can help. Critical thought can help diffuse bizarre conspiracies. If we had more teaching of critical thought in school or in society, perhaps it'd be helpful. My experience was I didn't learn much of that formally in an academic environment until my undergraduate degree that I got years ago. They were much more focused on critical thought and analysis, and you don't really get that sort of stuff in high school, you know? So a lot of people are unequipped with the tools that would be able to help them figure out what information makes sense, what information is worth having credence to, and what a good source is.
So a couple of things there that I thought about based on some of my interactions with, with people who did seem to be coming from an unstable place was when you were talking about conspiracy theories as, one of the three, I guess, big three drivers there is government. And I remember meeting a candidate at a lodge I was visiting, and I was encouraged to sit down and talk to him, give my opinion on what I thought for, as him for a candidate for Masonry. And it took about 5 minutes of conversation before he started talking about the involvement of Masons with the government and the lizard people.
Sweet.
So needless to say, my opinion was you may want to rethink this before you invite him to become a member.
Well, the lizard people is a clear tip-off, but Masons are involved at all levels of government. So how are you to tell there, right? I mean, I've worked in government and I'm a Mason.
Yeah, we've had several presidents, so that's one of those things. That's like, hey, not technically wrong, but.
Well, the second thing I've noticed too is a strong feeling of victimization. It seems to be a common theme because that was kind of his thing, right? Was he was on the fence because he felt in a way victimized by these conspiracies. And so I guess for him, his thought was, do I want to join them or not? And that's how he was on the fence. But when I was working at the inside the Grand Lodge building, it's like a magnet. And we would have occasionally people come in who had the wrong opinion of us. But I remember particularly there's this one young man that he came in, I would say he was probably in his early 20s. And it was interesting because it was like a buildup. So he came in several times, and the first time he seemed nice. He asked questions. He just seemed a little bit off, right? Like, so he had a couple of physical tics, and we just kind of wrote it off as, some people have those issues. And then the second time he came in, he was a little weirder, and you could tell he was a little more amped up, I guess. It was almost like he was escalating something within himself. Then the third time he came in, it was to the point to where we had to ask him to leave after he approached one of the ladies working in the building and said, "Hey, I could see you're a victim too." Not only was he saying she was a victim, but he was identifying with that. And at that point, we're like, we think it'd be best if you don't come back.
Wow.
But what really struck me was he felt that he was being victimized, and it felt like he was working himself up to take a stand, I guess, against maybe those he thought was victimizing him for whatever reason.
Like he didn't have the courage yet, or?
Yeah, I really got the sense that he was trying to talk himself into something And so my goal was, let's get him out the door before, he comes to a decision.
Yeah. Yeah. That's getting him out of the building and causing everybody to maintain safety has got to be the first goal. Absolutely.
So I was thinking, I thought of two questions based off of what you've said and what Billy's just said. Something that comes to mind is the concept, kind of in the conspiratorial lane, but on a very personalized level, is the concept of gang stalking, where you have some individuals that feel like they are being stalked by a really large group of people. David, have you encountered any of that, or are you familiar with this?
I've encountered some delusions along those lines from some psychotic people, sure, where they feel like it becomes that moves more into the realm of paranoid schizophrenia, where they feel there's somebody always watching them. They see somebody who looks at them a little bit too long. They think, oh, that's an agent who's watching me, or that's, a member of whatever, insert your villain of the month, whatever they are. Yeah, that can be pretty bad. There was another aspect of that I wanted to bring up, but it slipped my mind. So if it comes back, I'll be sure to mention it.
Okay.
The other thing that I was kind of wondering about is something that I don't know that there's an official term for it, but I have heard it referred to, I guess unofficially, as kind of the QAnon victim phenomenon. And this is where, and I've actually witnessed this in personal life. I didn't know that other people had been seeing this, but with me, it was a coworker. But you have people that are otherwise pretty mentally stable, don't have any major nastiness going on in their lives, right? Like they're in a stable place. They're not experiencing anything inherently destabilize them as kind of like an external motivator. And then they encounter the QAnon conspiracy theory, and for whatever reason, they get so sucked into it that it destabilizes the rest of their life. And I mean, I've seen somebody, completely deteriorate mentally after starting to quote do the research and stuff like that on this. Do you know if there's any kind of explanation for stuff like that, where people in an otherwise good place just nosedive real hard like that after encountering conspiracy theory thought?
Before I answer that, I remembered the thing that I was going to remark on before about the gang stalking. The other side of that is chronic stimulant use. So if people are on meth or chronic cocaine abuse, it can create drug-induced psychosis. So the old trope of somebody peeking out through their blinds after they've been up on a bender for days, wondering, which car has the cops that are staking out the house. Stimulant use can be really dysregulating. So I don't know if that necessarily factors into the conspiracy conversation, but it's another variable to keep in mind. Now, as far as the QAnon victim thing, I'm far from a QAnon scholar, or I have very limited knowledge on it. My understanding is that it's a sort of grand conspiracy that came from like one of the 4chan or one of those cesspool of the internet spots that really has no core to it. It's just this ever evolving and roiling kind of bubbling conspiracy with whatever the new focus is du jour. And people do tend to get brought up into that. And it's really, I've heard a couple podcasts on it, and it really strikes me as fairly interesting, because usually you have like David Icke. Okay, the lizard people are ruling everything, or oh, the Freemasons are behind the government, or blame it all on the Jews. That's a perennial favorite for horrible people. But the QAnon thing, there's no particularly one thing that's being blamed upon other than this like faceless cabal of people behind the deep state or whatever. And it doesn't get that specific. That way they can insert whatever they want into it. But if your research involves going to 4chan or watching some dude rant on YouTube, maybe check your sources.
Pretty solid advice.
Yeah.
I keep hearing the word victim. Would it be fair to say that like victimization is like the seeds for fundamentalism? I mean, because that just seems to be a running theme that is, woven into all these stories and everything.
I think you can really sort of prime the pump for fundamentalism. I mean, we have plenty of fundamentalists in the United States. They're not just people in Iraq or Syria. We have plenty of hardcore fundamentalists right here who are very concerning. And a lot of it is either people grow up in a very fundamentalist family where they're that's just the way things are. I mean, that's their culture. They're not really exposed to anything. They're strongly shielded from outside society. So they're not exposed to different modes of thought because those modes of thought are considered verboten. Either that or it's an area imagine Syria, right? Before the Arab Spring, that country was thriving. And as these other countries were throwing off the shackles of fundamentalism and everything seemed to be so exciting that year. But Syria, their leader just doubled down, started gassing people, bombing people, brutal reprisals. ISIS started coming in. You had Al Qaeda members coming in, became a proxy war spot, and it just absolutely fell out of control. So now that the country's been bombed to rubble and you have a generation of people who've seen nothing but war, they're pretty primed to accept fundamentalism or anything that they think may give them a sense of identity or hope in a pretty bleak situation.
Yeah, that makes sense when it gets really, because that's at the other end of the spectrum. Because I think about us here in our country where we have it good, as bad as it is in this country. We do have it great. But you alluded to it earlier, putting people on prescription for the news, because the politics really has the pitted against each other, us versus them. And it is in every facet of our life now. Even down to the advertising. People take serious whether they drive a Chevy or a Ford now, where that used to just be funsies, Oh, you're drinking that kind of beer? Oh, yeah. You know what I mean? They have completely divided us to where that kind of makes everybody a victim. And it makes sense why we're getting all of this, festering to the top in every part of the things that we considered sacred in our society, that were kind of the untouchables of violence. Because, I think about the debate not too long ago when we did pass the bill to allow weapons in lodge, and I know that's still controversial.
Optionally.
Yes, optionally, absolutely. But I guarantee you that brought a lot of Masons peace, after the horrible tragedy of Robert Wise.
Yeah.
So,
I honestly hope that with Freemasonry, with our strong civic focus, our focus on making communities better, our patriotic focus, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum. We say the Pledge of Allegiance, the national and state standards before every meeting. Sometimes more than once.
Yeah.
You open a Lodge of Sorrow, you say it. You open a Master Mason's Lodge, you then say that, So I hope that causes Masons to really reflect that we're Americans first, period.
Yeah. No, and it's been awesome seeing us, the outpouring of support for the family and things like that, because that's, to me, that's the getting out in the community that we need. As horrible as it is, all the stories you hear about the old time Masons and what gave us the reputation, it was because they were helping somebody that was destitute, and usually part of the fraternity, but not always. But moms and grandmas and sisters, they all knew, that they took care of you if something happened. And
that's true. It gives me a lot of comfort to know that I've got brethren who, if something happens to me and my wife needs some assistance, she knows all she has to do is talk to somebody at a lodge and she'll get some help.
Yeah. It has been the light in this bleak world for me. There's no doubt about it, because I couldn't imagine being out there and being like, where do I go meet some good people to hang out with? You know what I mean? Do I join a bowling league? You know what I mean? It's tough.
Well, and that, I guess that would also contribute to anxiety in some of these individuals too, is that sense of isolation.
Oh, yeah, that's huge. I interview people and do psych evals all the time. And one of the things I do is I always ask about family and social support structures, because people who have broad social support structures, like Masons, like people with the church community, people who are community involved tend to do so much better than people who are isolating. And, post World War II, we had the rise of the suburbs. And we had the multi-generational households declined as everybody, used the unprecedented prosperity of post-war America and bought their houses and started, doing the Cleaver model of mom and dad, raising the kids in a single family household. I don't know that did us a lot of favors. Actually, it sort of cut us off from our communities, and we're more and more isolated from our communities. I mean, I've been to a lot of places where people don't know their neighbors at all.
Mhm.
It's a little sad.
Well, and imagine this, I don't want to get into a generational thing, but we have an entire generation now, or at least the last 20 years, where some people, most of their engagement to anybody is not face to face. It's a disembodied voice on the other side of a headset or on the phone or what have you. There's no longer that interpersonal connection. It is now you are, I guess, for lack of a better word, you are kind of compartmentalized in your own little cube, and you no longer have that connection, that tangible, tactile connection to somebody else.
It's true. Within the mental health profession, there's been a lot of ink spilled about social skill development and concerns about that amongst millennials and Gen Z. Because us Gen X folks, we grew up without technology and got to see the rise of computers. And so we're sort of a hybrid generation. But, that we've been, mental health professionals have been sort of tracking general trends within society. And there's been a lot of concern about, is this actually going to cause us issues with social skill development? Because as we know, most of communication is nonverbal. Mm-hmm. So if you're not even hearing someone speak and you're just typing back and forth, like the chance of misinterpretations is extremely high.
That's an understatement.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, and I feel like, kind of touching on that, the digital native aspect of communication, right? I'm the youngest guy on this recording right now. And as you guys couldn't possibly imagine at all, I was a very awkward teenager, right? I feel like this should actually go without saying. I was a very strange I was a very strange child, and I was a very awkward teenager. And because of that, I had an enormous making friends in real life. And the friends that I did make in real life, some of them were really great guys. And then a couple were, to my shock and horror later, I found out that they were really terrible people. But I didn't have many friends, and I retreated online, right? That was kind of that space. And that did a ton of damage to me because I didn't get that social interaction, right? And it wasn't until I got to college and I was put in a dorm situation where, you have to interact with these people every day, and you have to be, you have to reciprocate social niceties and all this stuff, that I really started evolving and growing in any sort of level of communication, emotional intelligence, so on and so forth, right? And so college for me was a chance to totally reinvent myself. But I knew people in that dorm, for example, that even with that opportunity that was provided to them, still never took the chance to reinvent themselves, still decided that they were going to retreat from the world just in general. And you could, you could see that damage just multiplying in on itself. It was a very
Dude,
wild process.
It's so easy to do nowadays. It's so comfortable just to stay. You got net. What do you want to play on, video game? Play with your buddy. I mean, you can stay right there in your recliner the whole time.
If you have the money, you can get all the food you want delivered.
Exactly. I mean, and you can distract yourself really quick, and it's easy to do. And you don't realize what you're missing because, I mean, even when you skip lodge for a while, if you're a normal regular, because I just went through this, you forget what you're missing, and you finally get back up in the swing of things, and it's a totally different world when you start interacting with people outside your normal, your normal day to day.
Well, that's also why travel is so very important and highly regarded. I spoke earlier a little bit about culture, right? So people who are come from a fundamentalist culture that's very separated away, they don't get exposed to other cultures or ways of perceiving the world. Even so, in my practice, I talk a lot about culture because culture is basically the unwritten rules that we all live by. Like we pass each other on the sidewalk on the right-hand side. Why? Because we drive on the right-hand side. Guess what they do in cultures where they drive on the left-hand side? Well, they pass on the left-hand side on the sidewalk. It's not rocket science there, but there's a lot of unwritten rules that you just don't know until you stumble headlong into them in another culture. And people think about things in very different ways in very different cultures. And that's a broadening experience that allows you to understand the diversity of opinion and thought and experience in humanity. And it should allow for more compassion and empathy.
100%. I mean, think about the world just 60 years ago. The world wasn't as connected as it is today. The economy and people move. I mean, you've got just down the street people from every country, even no matter almost any state you live in. You didn't have that kind of experience before.
It's true.
So sometimes it's easy to identify somebody who is unstable, right? Or maybe they're not in a great place emotionally or psychologically, right? We have this, we have these cultural expectations, right? People conform to culture within reason, right? And if they break cultural markers, then hey, like something might be off about this person, right? Or if they're interacting strangely, or if they're like perpetually overly awkward, right? In a very noticeable sort of way, we might realize, hey, this person might be having some kind of mental or emotional conflict. But other times you get the dude like the one that was visiting Fort Worth Lodge years ago, who got 4 months into the process before the lodge realized, oh, this guy is like not okay to be around, right? How can we identify when somebody is having emotional or mental conflict or instability, especially when it can sometimes camouflage so well?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, you're not always going to have the disheveled guy on the street corner who's screaming at aliens coming to take him at the end of the week or whatever. I mean, those people exist. So they're there, and I hope that they get the care that they need, but that's often not the case. But like Billy was saying, with the guy who came to the Grand Lodge building, like he came 3 times, and the first time he seemed a little bit off, had some tics. People do have tics, but I wonder if that was maybe an expression of his anxiety and being the enemy's lair, right? Mm-hmm. If that's his mindset, like he's got to be nervous. Then the next time he exhibited more anxiety. And then finally he had disinhibited himself enough. He'd sort of rehearsed things enough and been able to have his foot slide off the brake enough to where he could then have that sort of victim rhetoric towards one of the ladies that was working there, which is weird and kind of gross and highly inappropriate. But that he showed his cards at that point. Now, there's an old saying that everybody is fighting a battle that you don't see. And that's true. I mean, we all have stuff going on. In psychodynamic psychology, we call so-called normal folks who have a good range of appropriate functioning. We're all referred to as healthy neurotics because we all have our neuroses, our weird things that we do and our stuff that we're wrestling with. That's what gives us our own spice or our own flavor, right? We're all dealing with stuff. And like Gabe said, he was a weird kid when he was younger, but you certainly had a glow up, man. You're doing great now. But
I've only committed 3 social faux pas today.
That's all right. People forget about those pretty quick as long as you're friendly. It's just when you wake up in the middle of the night 30 years later and you remember that faux pas like it just happened and your brain's being a jerk and you're up all night. That's the downside.
Oh, God.
Or is that just me?
Dude, you immediately drew one back into my mind from when I was a kid. It's horrible. Why'd you do that?
No, like you're laying in bed and you're just like, oh God, why did I say that? Or you're just in the shower and you're just like, oh man,
everybody hates me now. Yeah, it's your brain's being a jerk is basically what it's doing.
Yeah,
but
the shower one is especially helpful because you just you're hit with that memory and you go, if I really tried, I could drown myself and just end this.
Yeah. Well, my point, the intrusive thoughts, the morbid thoughts, those aren't always fun.
And we're going to divulge into therapy for Gabe now. So
yeah.
Well, I'll send you a bill, brother.
Self-care.
Well, my point being that really it can be very difficult to tell because a lot of people are conspiratorial minded, but they may not be looking to come and shoot a Mason. I mean, Brother Wise's story is an absolute tragedy, and I think that most people, like I've seen people picketing places, and they're clearly like QAnon conspiracy folks. That's pretty easy to see. And they've got the sort of mob mentality at that point. But if you're just talking to like a guy who's approached you to lodge, I think lodges should remain kind of open as a default and welcoming. We do need to have a good investigation process. I know we have a new investigation manual through the Grand Lodge of Texas that's been released. Brother Aaron Tazinski does a fantastic lecture on lodge security. Highly recommend it, and it may be worth having him on the show to talk about that. Even the previous episode of this podcast that dealt in such detail with your investigation process, fantastic. Y'all have got a good situation set up. Like I said, you had that guy hanging out for 3-4 months before things went sideways. If you just had a couple guys sign that petition, you voted on him that meeting after having only met him for 20 minutes, that guy would have been a Mason, and he would have been a Mason that was busted by the feds.
Yeah.
That's not great. That's not a good look.
Yeah, bad look.
We think about that all the time. And it was one of those moments. It's like we are on the right path, the full circle, like thumbs up, good work, boys, and it just drilled it into us that this is the way.
Absolutely.
And we've only bolstered it since then.
Well, I think that y'all are a leader in that regard, and I appreciate you being so explicit with it. I definitely recommend all listeners who haven't listened to that episode to go back and take it for a spin.
And the good thing is as I travel doing these OLTs, I see that it is catching on. More lodges are realizing, hey, we got to start taking this serious, not only just for, safety reasons, but in the end, you could be dealing with a knucklehead, a guy that's not, a felon or unstable or anything. He's just a butthead, for lack of a better term.
Oh, sure. Somebody you don't want in your lodge family, right?
You got it. And you can fix a lot of those problems on the front end.
Well, we're also astonishingly open in America with our masonry. Like we're wearing our Masonic hats, our shirts, you've got decals on your car, as long as you're not driving like a jerk, hopefully. But most places in the world, they're pretty down low about their masonry, and for good reason, because Masons have been persecuted around the world.
Yeah.
I will never forget being at the Tower of London, right? And I, my wife at the time, girlfriend, now wife, and I were touring the Tower of London, and we were having a grand old time. And I was wearing a fitted ball cap with a flat brim, because that's how I roll. And it was dark navy blue with a gold square and compass on the front, right? And I'll never forget getting pulled aside by one of the beefeaters and him very sternly asking, "Are you sure you know what this hat means? And why are you wearing it?" Right? Because he was concerned for me, right? Not that I was impersonating Masons or anything like that. He was worried that I might have been a person, not a Mason, representing myself as one, unaware of the risks that it poses to represent oneself as a Mason public.
That's fair.
That threw me for a loop, because it was in the US, and especially in Texas, right? Masons don't think about wearing, the emblem, right? Or any of the symbolry publicly, right? It's just a thing that we do. We have rings and pins and ball caps and shirts and all this other stuff. And we can talk about commodification and capitalism all we want, but the reality is we're very comfortable with that symbolry, right? And other people in other countries recognize that could be trouble for them, right? So they don't wear it. And so maybe there's a pretty good lesson to be learned there. I don't know.
Let me ask you this though, Gabe. Were you wearing a short sleeve shirt or a long sleeve shirt? Because there's two different Gabes. There's short sleeve Gabe and long sleeve Gabe. And I might question short sleeve Gabe.
I was, if I recall correctly, the weather was pretty miserable. So I was actually wearing like a Carhartt style jacket.
Okay, then you probably look pretty respectable then.
I don't know. I look pretty disrespectable, even on the best of days. So, yeah. Well, so go ahead, Billy.
Oh, I was gonna actually circle back to what we were talking about before. So, it may not always be obvious, that someone is having a moment, if you will, right?
A moment.
But there are signs you can look for, right? That as you mentioned, that the tics sometimes could be indicative that they're dealing with something internally. I know in our own case, Gabe, I don't know, I'm sure you remember the guy who came to our commandery's meal.
And the guy who scared the hell out of everybody? Yeah.
Yeah. With the
my gosh.
It was in the middle of the summer, probably a good 98 to 100 degrees. And he comes in wearing a bulky jacket, zips all the way up. And when we asked him to, hey, it's kind of hot, you want to take off your jacket? He's like, no.
Yeah. And he did take off his jacket at one point.
Okay.
And he was wearing like other thicker layers underneath. Like he had this like a puffy, right? It was like a puffy jacket, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And then underneath that, he had a sweater, and you could see a t-shirt underneath that as well. The weird part that had us thrown for a loop was that you could very clearly see that he was wearing something else under all of that, right? Once he took the jacket off is when I really started to kind of go into overdrive in terms of threat assessment, let's say, because he was definitely wearing something underneath all of that based off the outline, my immediate first thought was that he was wearing a bulletproof vest, just based off of having seen it. Like, I think it's kind of a weird statement, but I feel like most people, well, no, not most people, but I feel like all four of us probably know what a bulletproof vest looks like when it's worn concealed under clothing. And that was just my immediate, like, he's wearing a vest. Like, that's either a bulletproof vest or a stab vest or something. And this guy is a threat to be reckoned with.
So I had already, at that point, I didn't even see him take his jacket out because I had already found an excuse to excuse myself. And I went out to the car and I called the non-emergency police line and asked them if they could send a unit over to just, kind of check out the place. Yeah.
Well done. Well done.
And he was talking about like, you know, getting initiated, like he wanted to get initiated into Templary because he had like the inheritance rights to do so and stuff like that. It was,
oh yeah, that's weird conspiracy stuff too.
yeah, it was like he was fully on like, yeah, like, you know, like my great grandfather was European nobility, like I should be, you know, I have the ability to get initiated into the Knights Templar. And we were like, well, why are you here? And like, you guys in here. And I'm like, how do you mean? And he was like, you guys sent me an invitation via Facebook. Come to find out, he saw an advertisement on Facebook, or like not an advertisement. It was a recommended for you, right? And it was just listing Worth Commandery as a civic organization this guy might be interested in. And he took that as we invited him.
Okay, so there's an idea in or a term called ideas of reference, and you often see this in delusional people or psychotic people, where back in the day you'd think that the news commentators or people on TV were having discussions with you or passing secret messages to you, that what they're saying were referencing you and your situation. So ideas of reference, it's a marker of psychosis. But it's, as you pointed out, like Facebook has extremely targeted advertising now. So it's hard to tell. Was that an idea of reference, or did Facebook get him right because he was looking up Templar everywhere? And they're like, oh, here's some local Templar organization near you.
Oh yeah, the algorithm keyed in on that.
Is it possible that social media algorithms make this kind of thing more dangerous?
Sure. I mean, first of all, though, that Fort Worth Masonic building is not subtle.
No.
It is a big building. I mean, it's going to be a magnet. So anybody in your local region, I mean, they may skip over the little tiny lodges and they're going to go to that big, giant, gorgeous building that y'all have. So you're going to have a lot of the more questionable people showing up at your front doorstep just because it's so big.
Oh yeah, we've had guys come in who say that they want to come in and worship Baphomet, or they can change the weather, and so they feel that they're aligned with us and all sorts of weird stuff.
Well, tell the weather guy to make it a little cooler in Texas.
I totally forgot about that. No, this was a dude who accosted us outside of a commandery practice. What was it like?
Swords?
We had our swords.
Yeah, swords in uniform. Yeah.
He had
so sharp.
He needed the weather to change by like the next Friday, or the world would end, and he was like super convinced we could do that for him. So
yeah.
So what's the best policy with dealing with these people, right? Is it, engagement, non-engagement? Are there different, strategies that need to be employed or should be employed? How do we deal with folks like this?
Great question. I've read what little has been in the news about Brother Wise's situation, and it sounded like there was very little he could have done. The guy basically walked up, had a brief conversation, and shot him. I mean, it's absolutely shocking. That guy had worked himself up to do this beforehand, is premeditated, according to his Facebook posts that have been passed around. With something like that, I mean, how much can you do? Could you see if you could move and retreat back into the lodge and lock the door? I mean, there's only so much you can do. But really, I mean, what you want to do to try and keep yourself safe is de-escalation. You don't want to escalate anything. So listen to the person. Like, see if you can hear them out. Give them your full attention. Ask questions, avoid changing the subject, don't interrupt them, let them say their piece. Show some empathy. You can present concern, willingness to understand them without judging. Speak very calmly. And in fact, there's a technique that you can try out with people. I wouldn't say if it's somebody who you have a safety concern with, don't start there, but you can practice this with people if they're upset. You match their tone and demeanor and then sort of quickly bring your tone down to a calmer space. For example, I at the methadone clinic I worked at during my training, I was given my first patient, and he was a guy. I'm a tall guy. This guy was about my size and bigger than I am. And he was banging on this plexiglass window, the poor clerk, harassing her, talking about getting him in to get his dose, all this stuff. And he was upset. He really agitated. And so I was given the task of introducing myself as his new therapist in that particular moment. So I remember that technique, and I came up and I yelled at him. I was like, "Hey!" And he turned around, looked at me upset, and I said, "I'm your new therapist, David Hill. How are you doing?" I shook his hand, and I guided him away from the plexiglass and said, "Hey, let's talk about what's got you so upset. Like, tell me what's going on. Maybe I can help you out here." And he felt like he was being heard. And I heard him. I let him say his piece. I informed him about, policies, just like the lady behind the plexiglass did. But I wasn't a target then. I was somebody who took him aside specifically to listen to him and his concerns. And so that was de-escalation at that point. You want to avoid raising your voice to people. But the point there with that technique I was using was dropping the tone to a more calm tone. And I took him aside to a space that was a little separated from people so we could have quiet discussion. And he was able to kind of calm down in that moment. So some things you can do: give them undivided attention, be non-judgmental, focus on the person's feelings, not just the facts, because in these cases, the facts are going to be bizarre. Allow space for silence. A lot of people rush to fill silence because it gets uncomfortable socially, but allow them the space to just be in their thoughts and mull over, like give them space. Silence is okay. And silence can sometimes be used strategically to pull people to talk. If you don't respond, people start getting a little bit uncomfortable and they'll rush to fill that space themselves. And it's also good to use restatements to clarify messages. Like if they say, this is where they're, oh my God, the lizard people have infiltrated the Masons and now they're controlling the U.S. government, and that's causing all this civil unrest. Say, okay, so back to what you were saying. You were saying something about the lizard people, infiltrating the Masons. Tell me more about that. You're inviting discussion. You're inviting them to go more into a cognitive space. You're also creating a space where they're feeling safer because you're actually inviting their explanations instead of alienating them. The more obviously your first thought should be safety of you and the brethren and anyone around. So you want to look after that first, period, the end. But if you're in a sketchy situation and you can't just retreat, get them talking. As long as they're talking, they're not doing anything more violent. And if they start to see you as a real person instead of some wacky conspiracy projection, hopefully they'll develop some empathy for you and they'll be less likely to attack you.
A lot of that sounds like some of the techniques that I encountered in a book I read, probably about 10 years ago, called Never Split the Difference. And I'm totally blanking on the author's name, but he was an FBI hostage negotiator for years. And he ended up writing down a ton of his strategies and stuff like that in this book, Never Split the Difference. And what you're describing there, I guess he called it labeling, right? Where it's like, he said, it sounds like you feel XYZ about this, tell me more. So super cool to hear that, because it's like, hey, that's right out of hostage negotiation, I guess. Or I guess hostage negotiation is right out of psychology.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap. As a therapist, part of what we do is we challenge people. And we challenge people based on their assumptions. We often talk to people about the worst days of their lives, the most difficult things they've ever been through. It's not always that challenging in therapy. Sometimes there's a lot of laughs, and sometimes, there's triumphs that are celebrated. But sometimes you can get to some really difficult places. And as a therapist, you have to learn these de-escalation techniques and also ways of just communicating in a way that's non-judgmental, it's open, it's curious, and it's inviting further commentary, even though it may be gently challenging. Now, in this case, I would not recommend challenging these people at all, not even gently. The main idea is to get them talking so you can de-escalate. Maybe they'll disengage, or they'll give you the opportunity to gracefully disengage, like Billy did. I think him going and calling the non-emergency number is a great idea. My perspective is always report this stuff. If some guy's sniffing around the lodge and you have a safety concern, make a report with police. Get it on the books. I saw somebody in one of the social media threads suggest that this guy who murdered Brother Wise had firebombed another lodge in the valley. I don't know if that's the case or not, but if that's the case, then it suggests that this guy has been around and starting to act on these. Like, you can target a building, but then as you disinhibit yourself more, your foot slips off that brake, then you start going after people.
David, if you don't mind, I'd actually like to circle back to something you had said. You had talked about expressing empathy. And I think it's important to talk about that for a second, because a lot of people confuse empathy with sympathy. This is something that I used to work with my agents a lot in tech support, right? Because empathy is a great way to de-escalate the situation. But a lot of people confuse it with sympathy, right? Sympathy is I'm sorry. Empathy is I understand what you're feeling, right? I'm right there with you. And I guess the point I wanted to make is that sympathy sometimes causes the person to feel justified, right? Because if you're saying I'm sorry, then either they retreat, further into their conviction, obviously I'm justified for doing this, or they feel like you're speaking down to them, right? Just kind of dismissing them. But empathy is important because you're finding a commonality with them.
Yeah, exactly. You're both humans having a human experience. And now there was a landmine that you stepped on there. You said, I can understand. The immediate response to that is, no, you can't. You can't understand my experience. So that's a big landmine. Asking them about their experience, saying that must be awful. Tell me more about what that's like for you. That's an opening statement. It's an opening question rather than a close-ended question. And it's inviting more discussion, and it's also expressing your feelings. That sounds awful. The Masons have taken over the government. They've got this conspiracy. They're making my life, you all are making my life horrible in this X, Y, and Z manner. That sounds horrible. How did this happen? Tell me more. I wouldn't want to feel like that. But yes, you're exactly right with empathy versus sympathy. Sympathy is a Hallmark card. Yeah, that's not going to get you very far.
Yeah, if anything, it might rile them up even worse. One of the things that, you've kind of mentioned, right, is that people kind of slowly let their foot off the brake, and they are, and then sometimes they just go full gas or whatever. But, it seems like it's often, not always, but it seems like it's often a more gradual process, right? Where this person gives themselves permission to believe more, increasingly crazy stuff. They give themselves permission to do more increasingly dangerous things, or they just feel less inhibited. Let's say that we have somebody that, we've had a brush with somebody weird, right, who kind of popped up on our threat radar, but was not that terribly weird. And we've reported them, right, like we should, but we know that they're around. And every once in a while, they'll come and drop by, right? Because there are those, I can't think of anybody recently, but I know of lodges that get, let's say repeat visitors, right? How do we kind of help de-escalate or disengage them, or kind of move them away from this permission process over the long term? Is there a way that we can do that? Are there ways that we can help steer them away from the path, the long-term path of escalation?
Well, you can only have so much influence on another person's internal process. So there's that. I mean, I think that's a part of the issue. One of the things you can do, like I said, is report it. If it's concerning enough to report it. If they're making people feel unsafe, or like the Grand Lodge building example that Billy gave, after that third time, you might just say, hey, you're not welcome here anymore. We're going to have to ask you to leave. And if you do come back, police will be called and you'll be charged with trespassing. And that lets them know very clearly that, hey, there's a firm line here. Now that's going to work with quite a number of people who are not fully disinhibited. And I do use that inhibition versus disinhibition term very technically. So our frontal lobe of our brain, it's where our executive function is. And that's also where the brake is on our behaviors. And it allows us to inhibit behaviors. So our frontal lobes are the last part of the brain to basically get done developing. It doesn't finish developing until you're 25. Now, that's when, for guys, our car insurance goes down. Seems like those actuarials may be onto something there. But as a teenager, our emotional center is very well developed, but not our frontal lobe. So our ability to inhibit behavior is not very well developed. That's why as a teenager, we're all an emotional mess with a bunch of hormones who act the fool for years, and our poor parents put up with it because that's their job at that point. But that's a good example of what can happen. Now, I work with a lot of vets, and one of the most common injuries in modern conflicts are TBI, so traumatic brain injury, usually due to improvised explosive devices. So all these guys talk about how many times have you been blown up? They're on convoy and their armored vehicle gets blown up and it's landed on the side and they bang their head. Even like a concussive blast without actually hurting them, that can jiggle the brain around, which is basically like Jello in a hard container, and it can be injured. Well, if you start having some frontal lobe injuries, that's going to make it easier to disinhibit yourself, for the foot to slide off the brake. Trauma as well can cause more emotional dysregulation. You have chronic nervous system arousal that causes you more towards fight or flight. And if somebody's chronically homeless, for example, you better believe they've been traumatized a number of times. Most of those folks have, because if you're sleeping on the sidewalks, other people are going to take advantage of you. You've probably been beaten up a lot. You're putting yourself in unsafe situations. It kind of comes with the territory quite often, unfortunately. So things like that can really dysregulate people. I don't know if that answered the question or not, but some observations anyway.
I think that helps point towards things that cause that long-term dysregulation. So I think in a longer form way, that does kind of answer that question, right? Because it means that, hey, like if we help these people with those problems, we can try to help mitigate those situations. And a lot of that is societal, right? Like a lot of that is having that, right? So,
absolutely. And Texas, I believe, ranks at number 50 on mental health spending. And every session, the legislature talks about the mental health crisis we have in Texas and spends some money on it. But, we don't have the infrastructure to deal with the issues that we have in this state.
Wow. And that's amazing, especially because, as you were talking about, people who go through traumatic experiences. Well, we have a fair share here for one reason or another, whether, we do have cities that have, issues with homelessness. We have a tremendous number of combat veterans here that are dealing with the experiences that they had. And that, when you said, about veterans asking each other, how many times have you been blown up? That's just mind-boggling, right? I can't even imagine coming from a perspective like that, and the residual effects of those traumatic brain injuries. It is, wow, it's, like I said, it's mind-blowing. But for here in Texas, I mean, considering you do have we have so many issues, it's amazing that we don't have a better eye towards mental health care, public mental health care.
Yeah, I wish we did. Occasionally there's some good bills that are passed. I've been involved in legislative advocacy for the last decade in Texas through Texas Psychological Association and testifying at the Capitol and working on mental health bills and concerns. And I wish there was more that was going on, but there's only, as anyone who's ever worked in the legislative process goes, there's a lot that goes into a session. It's hard to get stuff moving because it's the whole state is coming together once every 2 years to try and get business done. Makes it tough. But hopefully, like, thinking about these things gives people a little bit of compassion for the people who are maybe a little bit disturbed or having a tough time, who may be a little bit off, who you're not sure. I mean, I don't want people to, be overly reactive. But at the same time, people are people and they're having a people experience. We all go through stuff. We've all had hard times. If people get really lost down one of these rabbit holes, they're indoctrinated and they may do severe things. But I think that's the exception rather than the rule. But still, it's important to have situational awareness and to consider the security of your lodge. I mean, if you're in just a little lodge building and you're having your meeting, are you locking that ground floor door when you're up there in the lodge room? Are you, if there's a door between the outside access and the tiler, is that shut and locked? Or is it just open to the public the whole time where anybody can walk in and you've got a tiler standing there with a flimsy, dull sword that will, if he misses you by stabbing you, it's certainly not going to cut you. It's very little protection, right?
Actually, and that brings up another point, is that most lodges, the tiler's inside the lodge room, so you don't even have that barrier.
A lot of times, yeah.
Yeah, this is a pretty good argument, and this is an argument that guys have been making for a long time, and I've always been fully on board. But it's a very good argument for having the tiler outside the lodge full time and armed with something, that takes magazines rather than gets sheathed.
I guess that would be up to the culture of the individual lodge, but I am definitely an advocate of having the tiler outside the door, actually tiling. So when in our lodge, when I spent my year after being master as tiler, not just for safety, but also because I remember being a young Mason, and back then you couldn't be in the stated meeting unless you're a master Mason. Well, so I sat outside and I talked to the tiler during the stated meetings, right? And those are some of my favorite Masonic moments. So that's neither here nor there, but
at the very least, the tiler should be armed with cameras that give a 360 view around the building, maybe, you know what I mean, to where he could see something coming, because there's a lot of technology that we can help keep ourselves safe, aside from weapons. Because some lodges are just aren't into that.
This guy is in charge of security. He should have all the tools of security.
That makes a lot of sense. What if somebody sets a fire at the front door of your temple?
Yeah. Or somebody, is walking through the back that shouldn't be, whatever. But, at the same time, something as simple when you leave, walking out together, like, I know we're all big burly dudes and everything. And, I don't think that he would have even had the opportunity, Brother Wise, if he would have known that guy was what he was doing. But I think it was done in such a way that there was no time to react.
Yeah.
Well, and I think pretty much anybody that's worked late night fast food knows you never leave the building by yourself. Right.
And that was, the wait and table thing. And, most lodges do, you walk out together, but especially a brother, that might take him a little more time to get in the car or whatever. Make sure he's got somebody to walk out with him. I mean, because something as simple as that could help.
Well, what you're talking about with having a camera outside, I mean, that's as simple as a Ring or a Nest doorbell. Yeah. And that's something that's within the budget of a lot of lodges. They can't afford a big giant camera system, but most of the time you can afford a Ring doorbell.
How much are those now? I think they're like what, 120, and sometimes they go on sale for $70, something like that. I might be out of touch though.
My buddy, it was a prime deal, but he got 4 Wi-Fi cameras put on every corner of his house for $100. And he threw an app. It's just like Ring, so you're probably not going to get them that cheap, but you can get them, and it's not going to break the bank. And especially if you're like have an Eastern Star or kids and, that meet up there, the Rainbow or D-Malay, we definitely owe it to them to be as safe and secure as possible.
Absolutely.
And God forbid if there is, someone who is having a a human moment, right? And now you have video evidence if you have to turn it over to the authorities.
That's right.
It's true. It's true. And I'm sitting here thinking, I don't know what number to call for a non-emergency. You know what I mean? That's something that the lodge needs to be armed with. Maybe that's right there by the Tyler, by the phone and the monitors.
Actually, that would be an incredible thing. Just like have a laminated sheet of paper, and it has, the address of this lodge is so and so street in so and so city. The nearest intersection is, any way and that way, right? So to help, people locate. Non-emergency police number, right? Poison control,
Nearest emergency room, nearest mental health clinic.
Yeah.
Things like that. Yeah. So like there's definitely like you could give your Tyler a one sheet, and using that one sheet, he could be very intellectually armed to assist with all sorts of stuff, right? Because imagine how helpful it would be to have somebody who'd be like, hey, call poison control. Hey, I've got the number right here. Let's dial it. Right.
Y'all help me add that to our Tyler duties to update that every year. That'd be great for them to have. Actually, and they just verify the info every year.
Actually, it wouldn't be a bad idea for the lodge to have like a disaster preparedness meeting, right? Once a year with the new officers to say, if X happens, here's how you address it. Here's who you contact. I mean, now that I think about it, I mean, we used to do that, when I helped manage the call center in the Philippines, we would do that every single year because, there you never know. You could have volcanoes, typhoons, you can have, revolution, you never know. But we would always get together and say, if this happens, here's how we, move forward.
That's a great point. I mean, because we're in a building so big, we better have a plan. Because if we're running around like chickens with our heads cut off in a serious situation, we could be in trouble. And that's any lodge, even a smaller one, have a plan for weather, God forbid an active shooter or, actually sheltering and in place if there's somebody outside.
I would say it's even more important for a lodge that's not as centrally located as we are, because if something happens in our building, there's a chance someone may notice it. But if you're in a lodge that's isolated from other buildings, or in a smaller community, something may happen that's not noticed by anybody.
Yeah, it's very true. There and this birds, because McAllen is a small town. There is no nook or cranny that's safe. Small or big town, we all need to do our due diligence.
Yeah.
Well, gents, I think that kind of takes us for the ride that we wanted to go on tonight. I think we've covered the subject pretty well. What do you think?
I definitely learned some stuff.
Yeah. Same.
Yeah. And I feel like we have stuff to take back to our own lodge, and help bolster our system, so I thought that was great.
Yeah, absolutely. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on again. Love you guys to death. Y'all are fantastic. I always have a great time with Fort Worth 148, especially hanging out with you guys up at Grand Lodge. It's always a pleasure to talk with y'all.
Ditto, bro.
Brother David, do you have any pluggables or anything that you'd like to advertise while we've got you on air?
No, not really. One thing is I have been approached by some Masons about possibly doing therapy with them. The problem there, just to kind of put things out as far as an ethical thing, is that if I know somebody or if I'm going to be around them socially, that means that that's a social relationship, and the therapeutic relationship is something very different. So unfortunately, I tend to pass those off to folks in the community because you want to make sure that the therapeutic relationship is absolutely pure. It's just a therapeutic relationship. This is your tracing board that you're drawing the designs upon, and you've got somebody who's helping you examine those, right? If somebody you're seeing socially, that kind of corrupts that relationship. So I'm always happy to help people get to resources. And I'm happy to help, maybe family members or something, but there's some ethical considerations there as well to make sure people are appropriately cared for. But no pluggables per se. I guess I've got my website if you want to get people in touch with me professionally. It's discovery-psych, psych.com.
Okay, cool.
Cool.
Yeah, and so Brother David is active on Facebook as well. So if you feel like you want to have him come speak at your lodge or at an event, that is one way to contact him. So we've all heard him provide talks at various venues, and he's a great speaker. So I'm volunteering you for all the unknown audience. But hey, y'all invite him. He's a great speaker.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I'm a previous speaker for Masonicon to plug your event.
Yes, so that leads us into Fort Worth Lodge's pluggables. If you want to learn more about the lodge, you can visit us at fortworth148.org or fortworthlodge.com, same website. We are at Fort Worth Lodge 148 on Facebook. Our email is info148@fortworth148.org. And Texas Masonicon is coming up very soon. It's the third Saturday in August, and it is going to be great. We're going to have a Friday night festive board, and we're going to have breakout speakers all day Saturday and a keynote speaker. And it's going to be a great time. You can get tickets and learn more at texasmasonicon.com. So texasmasonicon.com, texasmasonicon.com. So we hope that you've enjoyed the episode, and we ask for blessings on all our listeners and hope that y'all all stay safe and happy and healthy.
Ooh, you're so sweet, Gabe.
I try.
Guys, also, we're going to put in the show notes a link to the GoFundMe for Brother Robert Wise's family. It's very humbling to see the generosity, but their world's forever changed, and they're going to need a lot more than just funeral expenses. I mean, the man worked; he was 55. So, if you're in a position to donate, please do that. All right, gentlemen, let's close this thing down. This is Rhit Moore signing off.
This is Billy Hamilton signing off.
This is Gabe Yagish signing off.
And this is David Hill signing off.